get this party started. So welcome everybody out there, and happy Labor Day, happy Monday. I'm glad that everybody who is joining us are joining us for this special program. Um, First of all, my name is Abraham Ferrer, and I'm a staff member at Visual Communications, which is the nation's premier Asian Pacific American media art center. We are celebrating our golden year anniversary, this year. We were established in 1970 and incorporated in 1971 through the efforts of people who were, part of the UCLA Film School, as well as people who were responsible for founding the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. And since then, we've had a half century track record of service to the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And when you think about it, that really is, a lot of work and a lot of really great partnerships along the way. And, we're, really excited to have four of our partners here today for this special talk in which we talk about the legacy and the lessons that have been learned from the 2005 visual communications production Grassroots Rising, directed and produced by Robert Winn. Before we start, what I want to do is I wanted to go ahead and share with everybody a little bit of, of a prelude of the film. For people who are just joining us, Grassroots Rising is currently showing on Visual Communications' Vimeo channel, VC Connect, and it will be up. The paywall is down now, and it's available for free all the way through Election Day, November 3rd. And we're very intentional about that. There's a reason how come we are basically like having the film available for everybody through that. And in order to start talking about that, what I wanted to do is that I wanted to share with you just a little bit of a taste of what Robert and the visual communications crew had unleashed back in 2005. So hopefully you'll be able to see this, and I will go ahead and play that for you, and then we will be back with our panelists.
Do you see? Do you notice? Families working, people struggling. Glimpses, layers. Worlds converging. This is an old story, and it is new. Instead of Ellis Island, it is the Tom Bradley International Terminal at LAX. Instead of Angel Island, where Chinese detainees scrawled poems of waiting on walls, it is a secret sweatshop in an El Monte housing complex. Instead of internet moguls or model minority myths, it is the story of low-wage Asian immigrant workers in the urban sprawl of a layered Los Angeles.
All right. So that is just a little bit of a taste of Grassroots Rising. It's a 1 hour feature-length documentary that was produced in 2005, which is now available for streaming at VC Connect, Visual Communications' Vimeo channel. We are very, very fortunate to have with us some really special guests with us today. And let me just go ahead and very quickly introduce them to you all. First and foremost of all is the director and producer of Grassroots Rising, Robert Winn, coming to us all the way from Brooklyn. Hey, Robert, how you doing? All right.
Thanks.
All right. Next to Robert is Aquilina Soriano Versosa, the executive director of the Filipino Workers Center here in Los Angeles historic Filipino town. And people who have already seen the documentary may recognize her because she was the executive director at PwC at the time that Grassroots Rising was being filmed and what have you. And so basically, she's a lifer. Welcome, Aki. Glad to have you join us. Next to Aki is Sophia Cheng, an organizing coach at the Chinese Progressive Association in San Francisco. And she's been very, very involved with workers' rights, in the workplace. Sophia, thank you so much for making it this morning. And then finally, we have Parvesh Cheena, who a lot of people probably may know as an actor and a producer of a whole lot of really wonderful and funny works, both in broadcast and in the internet. What people may not know is that he is also involved with organized labor. He is a advisor or a member of the advisory board of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, representing two organizations of which he is affiliated with, the Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. So Parvesh, thank you so very much for making it all the way from, I guess, where are you at in Chicago right now? But I know that you basically took some time out to from shooting a film to make it out this morning. So we thank you so very much for for joining us. Actually, I was going to say Chicago and around that area is actually your hometown. So anyway, well, thank you again. Robert, let's go ahead and start with you. I made mention of the fact that Grassroots Rising was created in 2005. And it's been 15, 16 years now since the film has been finished and started making its festival run and broadcast debut and what have you. I wanted to start this conversation out by asking, in looking at the film 15 years later, what can you tell us, if anything, about how working class Asian Americans, how their situation either has improved, changed, or gotten worse in the 15 years since you and the crew started filming?
Well, first, I just want to thank everyone for coming out and for VC for having this event to commemorate Labor Day. Very fitting. Yeah, when you reached out with the invitation for this event, I was thinking to myself, okay, is 15 years a long time or a short time? And I guess it kind of depends on your perspective and for me, how I was feeling or not feeling that day. And it got me thinking about that period. And there are a few things that really stuck with me about the making of this film that I think are still relevant today. One is, the privilege of working with visual communications and the incredible team on this film. Leslie Ito, of course, Allison Dela Cruz, Tim J. And then you, Abe, is kind of like a fairy godfather. So thank you for that. And Linda Mabalat, and then Glenn Omatsu too, who was kind of the, the inspiration for a lot of the themes. And so the big ideas that still seem relevant today are one, something that's been a part of VC for such a long time, which is that cultural work is labor too. And that's been central to what VC's been all about. Another idea is that Asian American history is a labor history. right? And that's something that Glenn has been so important in reinforcing. And then the other idea is that the Asian American communities have been such an important part of the U.S. labor history uh, and global labor activism. And we saw that in the early 2000s with, the great work that those organizations were doing, right, in terms of worker centers being formations that alongside unions could really speak to where the communities are and what they needed in terms of labor organizing. Such powerful work.
Mhm.
And now I don't know whether things have gotten better or worse. I know that the work of the worker centers has been so important to put the community in a better place to deal with the challenges of where we are today. So I don't know. Does the arc of history bend towards justice, or does it take a very meandering route?
Mhm.
I don't know. Uh, but I do think that the worker centers, contributions of Asian Americans to the labor activism landscape have been really important to putting us in a better place today to deal with the challenges of today than we otherwise would be.
Sure. You mentioned the fact that things have gotten better. Well, at least for like some folks and what have you. One of the things that I come back to all the time when I think about Asian Pacific Americans, and labor and workers and what have you, is something that you mentioned in that we do have a very very rich history of being involved in worker movements and what have you, whether or not it's in the farm fields of Central California or the canneries of Seattle in Alaska, or the social service sector, and whatnot. So, and I think that if we're taking a look at something a little bit more recent, that documentary filmmaker Renee Tajima-Pena's massive five-part Asian Americans series really touches on that and reminds us of that heritage, particularly with something as important and impactful as the Great Picker Strike of 1965, which was instigated by Filipino American farm laborers and what have you. Um, let's go ahead and talk to a couple of people about some of the things that they're currently doing today. Aki, you know, in revisiting like the work that you do at the Filipino Workers Center, I'm of the impression that as we continue to acculturate, can become more ensconced in this whole American experience, as it were. There are still people who are coming here seeking a better life and still, encountering a lot, more struggles and what have you. And I think that is made more palpable, by the fact that we are currently living in a time that is a lot crueler, like a lot more. Um, Precarious, for workers and what have you. Obviously, this presidential administration, but the impact of a global pandemic has really laid bare, inequities, in terms of who has or who has not. And stuff. I'm wondering, if you can talk a little bit, about the things that you are experiencing and that your team at PwC are experiencing today.
Absolutely. I was thinking about what Robert said. Is this 15 years a short time or a long time? And really, it's actually both, right? And because I was also reflecting after watching the film again, that a lot of things actually have changed, and then there's some things that absolutely haven't changed. In the Filipino community, we still have a large population of undocumented workers, undocumented immigrants who are coming here for a better life, because the inequalities in the world still exist. And so there's still such crushing poverty in the Philippines that's continuing to push people out, to put them in vulnerable situations to try and find a better life for their families. And that's absolutely continuing today. PwC, we've actually grown a huge, a pretty large anti-human trafficking program now, especially in the last 5 years, that you know, it looks a little bit different than the El Monte case specifically, but it's really labor trafficking. We're seeing, you know, these different ways that immigrants are coming here trapped into circumstances that they were not anticipating and working for very little or free. And so this has expanded us to like expand to different states. So we're working in about 5 or 6 actually different states with human trafficking survivors around the country. So at the same time that things like, you know, this is still happening, you know, and people are still believing in the American dream when they come here and realizing that it's not exactly what they expected. But at the same time, like these last 15 years has seen a huge growth in our organizations and in the organizing work that we've been doing. So we haven't just been spinning our wheels, actually. We've actually made progress as well. And so it's like, it's not a straight path, you know, and we're continuing to struggle with all of the difficulties that we've experiencing with the past administration, with the current administration, you know, and but now we're actually, I think a lot of the worker centers that were featured there, we've actually grown to another level than where we were, a different level of sophistication even. If we think about, well, since then we've passed the California Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And so we're actually ended 75 years of exclusion from overtime protections for workers. And we've won back over $1 million in back wages for domestic workers, for caregivers. And we have huge cases like $7.1 million citation for care homes who have stolen wages. And we're working together with the California Labor Secretary, Labor Commissioner's Office, in a whole different way, and engaging in figuring out how we can actually change things and build power. We build power in those direct actions with employers, but also in governance as well, and how workers' voices can actually build more power from our communities who, as we see in the film, you know, are a lot of times marginalized from the more mainstream labor union movement. And actually worker centers and labor unions are actually working more and more closely together. Also, that's changed tremendously over these last 15 years. And actually 2005, 2006 is when we just started the National Domestic Workers Alliance as well. So we've actually built you know, this whole national movement that has like over 60 different affiliates across the nation and is working internationally with other domestic worker organizations. So while we still have so far to go, we've actually been really building and organizing. And just to think, yeah, the last 15 years, you know, there is a lot that has changed. And yeah, but from $65 average, I think Strella, our organizer, said for caregivers, now it's more like 125 or 130. That's still below minimum wage, but it's actually higher than inflation rose. And a lot of that has to do with actually how we're shifting things and shifting worker power in the industries.
Great. Excellent. You know, you mentioned, you know, the fact that that wages, among other things, are getting better for, folks and stuff. Back 15 years ago, obviously wages were, very, very abysmal, for workers and what have you. And as you're talking about that, I fixate on a statement that our current um, leader said during, the 2016 presidential election, and during the debates, he did make this remark in response to a question as to whether or not it's time for American businesses to raise the minimum wage to $15. And if I remember correctly, because this is really burned in my mind, that he said no. It's not necessary, and that in fact a $7.25 hourly minimum wage is, in his opinion, too high. For American workers and what have you. I think that typifies some of the attitudes that that are still pervading this society. Sophia, I wanted to go ahead and use that to pivot to your work in terms of fighting for workers and wages and what have you. Aki, did allude to the fact that that wage theft has been, and I would suspect still is, a very serious issue, and the fact that we are having these conversations about raising a minimum wage that is already seemingly a little bit low because people have been talking about it but not doing anything about it, to the point that I'm of the opinion that $15 minimum wage to get us to the year 2020, I think that we should be talking about a $19 an hour minimum wage, because like you spent too much time just like talking about it and not doing anything about it. But in the meantime, workers, are still getting fleeced. So I wanted to find out from your perspective, Sophia, where that stands 15 years, after Grassroots Rising, and what's happening now.
Sure, thanks, Abe. That's a great question. And I have my phone calculator next to me. So I was calculating what $15 even is. So if you are making a $15 minimum wage, you are working full-time, 40 hours a week, your annual salary before any taxes is $31,200. We know, looking at demographic information about Asian Americans, that about a third of Asian Americans are on the West Coast, which is really expensive housing. So if you're making $31,200 a year, to have a monthly rent that's livable, right, that's about a third of your income, you should really be spending about $867 on rent. I challenge anybody in California to find good, livable housing for $867 a month. It's just ludicrous. I think some things have changed and some things have stayed the same. So watching the video, I noticed that Glenn Omatsu provided a lot of context about the API community. Some of the things that are still the same is that we are still the fastest growing ethnic group, racial group in the US. And we are still one of the most class polarized groups in the US. So one of the biggest challenges of organizing API workers is to even bring visibility that we have a large working class population. And wages are super important. Chinese Progressive Association was kind of at the forefront of a movement that started locally to, one, raise the minimum wage, and then secondly, actually enforce the minimum wage. So Aki had mentioned before that, it's that one of the ways that the worker center movement and the labor movement as a whole has grown in sophistication is our ability to really govern and hold government agencies accountable, and even actually bring some of our advocates and organizers into some of these enforcement positions. Like in the video, Julie Su has mentioned a little bit in the El Monte trafficking case, and now she's the state labor secretary. And so I know the video references people saying things like, oh, we'll work with workers and refer cases to the government and report it. We're actually at even a higher level of sophistication, like Aki was saying, where community organizations will actually train and organize workers to have really strong cases and be the leaders in their own workplaces and in their own industries to root out wage theft. Because often there's a misconception that wage theft only happens in really small businesses or businesses where the employers don't know the law, when actually you see that wage theft is endemic in many low wage industries because it's actually part of the business model of doing work. So you even have big companies like Uber and Lyft. These are obviously large US corporations. It's not a small immigrant run mom and pop. California has actually just filed a lawsuit against Uber and Lyft for, they call it systemic wage theft, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to root out wage theft, workers really have to be at the forefront because they're the ones experiencing it. So they're the ones that have to report accurately the working conditions. And a lot of times there's fear, but what we're finding right now during the pandemic is that in some ways, workers are, well, in a lot of ways, workers are even more precarious and in a fearful position because of the pandemic. But that's why it's more important than ever for workers to speak out. And workers are continuing to speak out and organize during the pandemic. For Chinese Progressive Association, I think just a few weeks ago, we were able to announce after 3 or 4 years, we were able to support a group of 133 Chinese restaurant workers at Komei Japanese Seafood Buffet to win a $2.6 million settlement in a wage theft case that had gone on for years in Daly City, and the employer actually even tried to evade responsibility by closing the business. And we're continuing to support workers in these type of workplace campaigns to hold their employers accountable. Yeah.
Wow, that's great and stuff. Parvesh, let me go ahead and take it over to you. Because you basically occupy a space that is perceived, to be one in which people, in your position, get boku bucks and what have you. But I think that one of the things that we do forget is that artists who work in the mainstream entertainment industry here in Los Angeles and nationwide, for that matter, they are working, people too, and are just as susceptible, to to being, undervalued, in terms of money and, and what have you, and such. But I'm just kind of curious, you know, how important, is it for organizations, who are part of unions and guilds, whether or not it's, SAG-AFTRA or the Directors Guild of America, or, if I can, rattle off even a couple of other unions that I know, the American Society of Cinematographers and the Motion Picture Editors Guild, to align with a larger labor practice, such as, with Apala, and what have you. I always wonder about that. I'm, when I looked at your resume, I was like really surprised and pretty proud that, SAG-AFTRA, is positioned as a very, important, advisory board member, to Apala, and what have you. But I kind of like wonder if you can talk a little bit about, that importance of representation, and valuing of artists, in this whole, idea of labor and working people.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Labor Day early. One thing, Ava, I just wanted to correct, just a little housekeeping. SAG and AFTRA are actually now one unions. Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists merged. That was actually the reason why I got involved in union leadership when I ran in 2011 I was a LA local board member for 8 years. It was solely to merge because coming from Chicago, LA sometimes can be a different thing. LA can be different than the rest of the nation for our union, and we were not merged, so like as digital as this became one media, and when these videos become holograms off our wrists or brain implants, it's still going to be stories told with performance. So I merged because I think there's something about minorities and other members. We know that there is strength together, so it was just always a no-brainer, like why are we competing against each other? So we merged. And when I think about the artist element, I'm very fortunate. I am privilege upon privilege. I have education privilege. My parents being later immigrants, post Chinese Exclusion Act, post, Johnson and Nixon, when they opened it up, that kind of next, the brain drain. That's the generation that my parents came in. Not, when we have other siblings whose families have been here from, the 19th century, let alone early 20th. So we weren't, the idea of like union stuff, or like my dad was engineer to small business owner because he didn't want to work for the man anymore. He wanted to be in charge of his own thing. And I do remember even in the late 90s, in a sense, my dad's Republican, my mom is Democrat because she learned. And she was an immigrant woman, an American, so she got kind of whip smart. But South Asians sometimes can align with that whole model minority stuff because we came here later. The privilege was that the first ones of us who came were the STEM people. We know all this. So the idea that an artist son of a small business owner, franchisee immigrants would be such a union person is just because it was just, I come from a perspective that you should at least have the bare minimums for people. Like, great. I also do think that if you can make more than that, wonderful. But what about the base? That's when we do. I remember even in the film, Robert Aki mentioned this about that, because that did stick with me. I have my notes right here. The $65 to $125 now, that's pretty much what background workers make. That's their minimum for, and these also are my opinions. I don't want to speak for the union on everything, but just my take on it is there is a hierarchy. We know this. Will Smith, Meryl Streep, Reese Witherspoon, Aquafina, to bring it Asian, are going to be at a lot different perspective than like our, the people who just need to be crowd seen. So there is this thing, we're having a healthcare issue like and it's not just unique to actors, artists, but like health is, our health plan is the rates are raising. People might be dropped. It's a issue. So artists, don't forget that there is a history in this nation from the New Deal, from FDR. I mean, that they literally put artists to work. There's a musical, Cradle Will Rock, that speaks about this. What I've been finding, and Robert, there's a lot of inspiration. So, and like Aki mentioned, like 15 years is not long. I remember 2005, my first year in LA. There's so many things that were like, was this film like 2015, 2010, 1980? These same struggles fit us all. What I'm seeing with the artist, minority, and not to mention labor movement, there's so much intersectionality happening. We used to think like, oh, I'm an actor, I'm an artist, I can't play a part. I'm Indian American, I'm a minority, I'm not going to be a part of this. We forget that and I wrote this under, there's a lot of education that is still happening and needs to happen with our communities. There is a crux right now. Maybe it had to be this bad for our national psyche, labor mindset under the threat of this administration. How, I don't know if it's an American thing or a human thing, we tend to really only show up when we're at the very low, very bottom, thinking about climate change today. Before we were like, this is a problem. So we're seeing that a bit with labor as well. Like, there's a thing like, this is one element. Even being a gay person, the LGBTQ community we have to have this inclusivity. And the biggest moment I'm finding with all of this labor, again, as an artist, as a queer person, and as a minority, Aki, you hit on this a bit, but like, I finally feel like we're all realizing it's better to work together. Robert, when the Latino Hispanic gentleman mentions, like, I love this quote. He said, we tried to work with the Koreans before. It was hard. Like he mentioned that in 2005, I think when they're in front of the Aussie market. So it's just brilliant. Like, that used to be an issue. Like, remember, I've done this joke for about 10 years with VCI. Like, we South Asians were like, oh yeah, you guys brought us into the big Asia community because it's a big continent. But there were times like even we, the Asians, Indians felt a little like different. My big take from all this is that right now we have to work together and we are all coalescing. Biden might not be everyone's perfect, for example, but he's what we have, because no matter what, I'd rather hold our guys' feet to the fire than not have any place at the table it feels like we've not had in the last few years. So I ranted, I raved too much. I'm trying to work on my interrupting, so that's why I wrote down some notes from my previous speakers.
No, that's perfect and stuff. And I think that you talked a little bit, about something that I wanted to circle back and ask, folks about and stuff. And it's the idea that, if we go back, say, to the lessons learned from, director Tajima Pena's documentary series, is that Grassroots Rising does reflect the fact that an Asian Pacific American community or an Asian American Pacific Islander community, such as it is, does not acculturate or does not become quote unquote American at the same rate and whatnot. I come from a generation where I grew up with 1950s and 60s activistas who were involved with the free speech movement and the anti-Vietnam War and ethnic studies movement. Many of the people that we're working with, came here in the 1960s and 70s, after that immigration reform happened. Some of them, grew up on MTV. Some of them, became much more wired than we did. I mean, like, I take note of the fact that in the 15 years since Grassroots Rising was produced, that the world has become so much smaller because of the internet. And I do make mention of the fact that 6 months after Grassroots debuted in November of 2005, YouTube first went online, and that basically like opened the floodgates to a whole lot of things. But I think that in the 15 years, I kind of see where we're not all acculturated, at the same rate and the same time, where you have like the third and fourth generation old school activistas from Japanese American and Chinese American communities. You have these other ones who haven't been here nearly as long and haven't been part of like this American experiment. We're talking about Filipino Americans, Vietnamese Americans, South Asian people who are not Desi and who are American born, for instance, Laos, other folks and what have you. And sometimes it's a little bit frustrating, I think, to see things like Vietnamese Americans for Trump or Filipino Americans for Trump. And besides like shaking my head every time I open up my YouTube, again, and I'm confronted by that, it just makes me realize that people look at us as like this whole big monolith, and don't just aggregate our communities. We can't look at ourselves in terms of nationalistic perspectives the way that African Americans can, or whatnot. And I kind of like suspect it's the same way with Chicanos and their relationships with other people from Central and South America, and whatnot. So I'm kind of wondering, and I'm just going to like throw this out. Does the Asian Pacific American community today, what kind of challenges, do they and the people in those communities pose to you in terms of the work that you do? Robert, as a filmmaker, I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, I'm wondering what YouTube's algorithm knows about your viewing habits in terms of what it suggests for you. We can talk about that later, but yeah, when you were talking right now, I was thinking about Karen Ishizuka's book, Serve the People, Asian Americans and the long 60s. And basically, it's a book about the rise of the idea of Asian Americans as this umbrella category, right? Pointing out that, the Asian America is like a construct. And before that, there were different communities that largely organized around national origin, right? And so come the long 60s, there was more of an emphasis, along with all the turmoil and progress of the 60s into the kind of, following on the civil rights, following and alongside the Chicano rights movement, this idea that Asian Americans from all sorts of countries and backgrounds have a common cause. And this idea is really powerful to me as someone who's Hapa and because it's harder for me to kind of essentialize my identity, right, and say, oh yes, I'm one thing or another, because I'm not. I kind of a mixture of things, both literally and culturally and whatnot. But the powerful thing about that, Asian America as a construct that is basically a community of action, is that it's the idea of community as one, something you choose, and two, as something that's active. And so I think, in response to your question about where things are today with that, I think it's like one aspect of the movement building more broadly that needs to happen, is to kind of pull together all the different strands of the different communities and get them to recognize the common cause.
Mm-hmm. I see. Aki, Sophia, and Parvesh, do you guys want to take a crack at that?
Sure. I mean, you said a lot when you talk, so I'm probably just gonna focus in on a little bit some thoughts that I had. One was, like Sophia mentioned, the API community is one of the most class. Is it? What did you say, Sophia? Class
Polarized.
Polarized, right? Because in actual demographics, we have these very successful professionals. We do have, a good part of our community that's doing well, but we also have this huge part of our community that is working class, right? And so we're not a monolith in many different ways. So there's such a huge diversity of who actually makes up the different parts of the Asian Pacific American that population is so broad and the conditions are so very different. But even within those, like, the class differences are also so extreme as well. But like Robert said, it's created an identity to help us build power together also towards common cause, right? And when Grassroots Rising came out, we're not long out of, like, PwC, Kiwa, and Thai CDC. We all used to be in one office together. Like, PwC learned how to do wage theft from Kiwa. Kiwa and Thai CDC offered us free office space so that we could get started and mentorship, and so it's like this type of solidarity together, not kind of like artificially, but really around concrete things that we're all trying to build better lives for ourselves, our families, our communities, and that actually the only way that we can really do it for our whole community is not by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? But the action that we can take is actually by coming together collectively to fight for each other. And as we're fighting for each other, we're actually fighting for ourselves, right? So, I mean, I loved seeing Mrs. Lee at the protests screaming, like chanting for the ASHI workers when, they're coming down on the protesters and the little kids, right? I think it's this kind of solidarity that is around values is what we need to really come together around. And I think that has to do with, like, I mean, our community is polarized in many ways. There are a lot of Filipinos that are watching way too much Fox News, for example, and, and wearing red hats, you know, and what we've been finding is, you know, when you actually get to more very specific issues, so like with our electoral work, we really do focus in on ballot initiatives, for example, because when you can pull together people and people see each other face to face, they value each other overall. That's what we found when community members come together and they talk about issues and we talk about issues with them. They actually value family, they value education, and so they value fairness, right? They value being safe in their own communities, and having, you know, that everyone should be able to have a healthy life. So I think it's really that we need to continue to organize, first of all, which is organize, and not only organize those who are already organized, but we need to reach out more broadly and really bring our whole community together. And we need to continue to do this. And it makes more, it's so important, especially now, because who is in administration, who is in leadership does make a difference. And I think, like Parvesh said, you know, I'd rather hold someone's feet to the fire who is already in more alignment, or at least will listen, you know, versus someone who is so blatantly for their own self-interest and for the interest of 1%, the 1%, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, but we have to bring people together around real concrete issues. So not just a polarization of, you know, there's so much, like, you know, information that's confusing in the media. And they just, you know, they just speak to certain parts of, I don't know, it's, for immigrants, we're always trying to also like find our place. And so sometimes that feeling of insecurity, you're trying to align yourself in certain ways, or have beliefs in this American dream and other things, you know. So I don't know. Anyways, that's just some thoughts that I have. I'll let someone else talk.
Sure. Sophia and Parvesh, in the couple of minutes that we have before I open it up for other questions from our audience, if you have any thoughts on, you know, on this.
I'll wait for Q&A.
Okay. All right. Right. And then Sophia as well. All right. Well, at this point in time, you know, this is your turn to check back with our panelists here and to ask us questions about Grassroots Rising and the lessons, you know, that it teaches us, or it has taught us, about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and, you know, labor and organizing. You know, and whatnot. So we encourage you, if you have any questions or have any specific comments, you know, to please, you know, let us know. And although I'm not seeing anything at the moment, I think that, you know, Parvesh, you know, made a comment around, you know, I guess like I don't remember this anymore because I kind of like didn't take any notes, but a couple of people had like a sense of identification with your comments that you know, their parents, in particular their dad, you know, too, you know, was is somebody who basically you know, listens very intently to things like, you know, the old time gospel radio hour or Fox News or what have you, and just accept it, you know, as like their Bible of how America should be. I mean, like, heaven forbid, you know, that, you know, we should, you know, bow down at the feet of Tucker Carlson.
Well, I'll tell you, like, what it is when I'm going to talk in very blunt terms that are not my point of view, but I'm giving the perspective of my dad's friends and that generation.
Mm-hmm.
They came here, they went to Chicago, and I just only learned this in the last few years. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, we all know in our native languages, we could, if I'd said like my Dadaji, you know my dad's dad, but you know, in English, we have to always say, my grandfather, my father's father, was actually a communist.
Mm-hmm.
I only learned this a few years ago. He has a Wikipedia page. He went to Berkeley. He spent time in Russia with Lenin and Stalin, whole other, that's a whole other thing to, deal with my therapist about. But just learning that my father, because you know how, children aren't, and now my father being a Republican conservative uh, engineer, like how opposite children are of their generation, of the first one. And I did ask my dad, I talked to him, I'm like, why did you tell me about your father living in California, my adopted state now? He's like, I didn't get along with him. I didn't like, that kind of mentality. So you had someone who was politically minded, my grandfather, then you have the son who just wants money because he thought engineering would be this. It's just an escape. He wanted to come to America, full stop. He dropped our last name because it was easier to get the green card in the Cold War to not be associated with your father being a communist. So Sukhjit Singh, for my dad, is easier. Singh is a kind of like a generic name that all Sikhs have, or one part of it. So he just dropped the last name and he was fine. They came here, they spent maybe a year or two in Chicago, and then they got to get thee to the suburbs, white flight, the model minority myth that they pushed on them, saying like, don't be like those, these are their words. Don't be like the lazy black people or Latino people. They're all on drugs. Get to the suburbs. We'll give you the 30-year mortgage. We'll give you the loan. Oh yeah, that bank said no, go to this bank. My friend works there. He normally says no, but he'll say yes to you. Literally that kind of alignment with white supremacy, the majority. We all know we're all deconstructing it now, but there is that vibe that they still, my dad and mom, I had to teach mom, like we're all having the South Asians for Black Lives right now, because we're finally going to explain to our parents, like, this is why we got to go to the burbs. Mom, do you remember when you left Harris Bank and went to Bank of Chicago because that Harris Bank guy didn't give you a loan? But you got to go to the bank next door and you got it. There are a whole generation and whole groups of people that didn't even have that. So I do feel like, Aki, when we talk about like how even when we look back at Grassroots Rising, it's so stuck with me, Robert, that gentleman, the Hispanic gentleman saying that the Koreans were hard, because it was easier for the people in charge, even when they're our color, our skin, to play us against each other than it would be to have us all getting the same benefits. So we see that. That is that mentality. Remember the crack epidemic? Crack, bad, black people, drug. Oh, opioids, white people, West Virginia, let's help, let's do this. There are all these elements that we have to see that they've been playing us. So mom is understanding it now more than she ever had. Why would she say track the black people in the store for suspected shoplifting when it was always the white teenager from my high school, 2 kids who got I found, picking up stuff. So just all these biases and expectations, they're shifting, they're changing. But I do see like why certain our parents are, and I talk too much, I know, I apologize. People who leave a country sometimes don't tend to be the artist, or the liberal. Bollywood, huge film industry. Priyanka Chopra is really the only one who's come over here to make a stand in
Yeah.
They don't want to come over here. They're not going to get the servants and drivers and all the perks that they get over there. They're really like, why would you be here? Yet the people, the scientists, the doctors were like, you're just chasing the cash to leave. They don't have the tie to it as much. And then that conservatism that they keep on us is not, it's the same of anyone who wanted a money job, so there's that balance of immigrant conservatism. We know why. But we're finally trying to explain our standing sometimes in this country is on the backs of hundreds of years on Black, indigenous, other Hispanic, Latinx people. Like, it's just that disconnect is finally coming to light now, and it is on us. The charge is on us.
Yeah.
Telling our older generation, we made the Fox News joke, but like, we're not them. We are not that. Model minority thing still just plays us against each other instead of all of us together.
Yeah.
It's so striking. Even my comedy has changed because I realized that mine was sometimes in service of the white majority. Oh yeah, look at those weird Asians. Oh, look at those gays. I'm not as gay as those people. Let's make fun of them. We always wanted to belong more. And it's just especially with art and actors too, we have to realize this can be in service of only the majority and not of like our siblings who are also the same place. It's fascinating. We are so at like that crossroads. It's like that weird intersection in Beverly Hills where there's 7, 8 streets and no one knows who to go next, but we're finally at that place and we're installing stoplights so we can all take our turns.
Sure. So let me go ahead and take a question. Actually, it's a two-part question from one of our viewers, our guest here this morning, Ivy Dallo. Hey, Ivy, how you doing? Thanks for joining us. She has a question I think is kind of like a free-for-all for everybody. Her first question was, can any of you share about a specific moment or conversation you've had with a community member that further motivated you in your work? In other words, an unforgettable conversation or moment you've witnessed that that helped fuel you and the work that you do. Let's go to the to the organizers here, Aki and Sophia. If you want to take that question.
You want to go first, Aki?
Doesn't matter. Well, I've had a lot of conversations with workers, and I think it's kind of rooted in the part 2 of question 2, but like in terms of how to contribute. But I think what I've seen also evolve over the last 15 years is worker leadership and the types of roles and things that workers are doing. In PwC, we have some amazing workers who are just like, as volunteer member leaders, taking on whole chunks of work to bring more people in, and also to think through like how we're helping people to like who are scared about going through a wage theft case and helping. So we have one, Tita Emily, who also assists other workers and talks to them about the process. But I also, there's one conversation. So we actually Fidelina was actually 6 decades human trafficking victim as a domestic worker. She was brought over by a Filipino family, and for 4 decades here in the US, 2 decades in the Philippines, worked for this family, raised basically like 2-3 generations of kids, and wasn't paid at all. And we were able to help her like liberate herself from that situation only a couple years ago when she was 62. And she 62, I'm sorry, 62 or 82, I'm getting mixed up now. Anyways, she and so she, even though she had gone through like decades of servitude, she recognized that the situation was unjust the whole time. And even though, like, I think a lot of folks in that situation that she had been through, where she had been also abused and, physically and mentally, would have been so traumatized by it. But she, right away, she always is so positive, optimistic, and also just like she'd tell workers, don't let yourself get in a situation like me. You've got to fight for yourself. Don't let injustice happen to you. Reach out to others. I didn't realize that, there was others who would also support her if she was going to try and fight for herself, but that, tells other workers, to also stand up. And she just inspired so many people and so many other workers that they could also do what she did in terms of liberating herself. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to support workers, right? We need to support them because it's so hard. Like Sophia talked about the Comey case. Like, it's so hard for workers to actually stand up to their employers when they could lose their only source of livelihood, right? That they're so dependent on, that so many who could also be deported, especially in this time, right? So I think as a community, we really need to gather together around workers and support them. Like Cold Stone. I just went out to support some of the rock workers at the Cold Stone action because there's 3 young workers who were fired because they were just asking, like the employers had put up some weird, probably like the federal minimum wage versus like what LA and California should be. And they're like, this is not right. We should be getting minimum wage. And they all got fired. And so they've been working on this campaign together. We had an action, went in, and then an hour later, the management actually contacted them and paid them the wages that they were owed, their back wages. But it's hard to do that. And so like as community, like being there to support them and know that what they're doing is important, not only for themselves, but like for changing conditions for other workers, and that it's such a brave and courageous thing to do to really try and challenge what's happening and the injustices. We need to continue doing that and being very public about it too.
Sure. And Sophia, your thoughts?
I know we're over time, so I'll just say really quick. The moments that fuel me and just that I kind of hold on to and like polish like little rocks whenever I feel down are always the direct actions, like Aki said. So in the entire range toolkit of like passing legislation, talking to government agencies, reporting violations, like direct action is when workers get together and they directly, oftentimes creatively go and actually confront their boss. And all of this stuff, even if you're middle class, whatever, like we've all had jobs that we don't like, where you wish you could just say, you know, XYZ thing to your manager. And when workers actually come together, organize, and think very systematically, what is it we want to ask for? Who's going to say what? And how are we going to do it? What visuals do we want? Who do we want backed up? Do we want a lawyer in a scary suit to stand next to us? And at the end of all of us saying our stuff, say, by the way, this is their right to do this. You can't retaliate against them. When we do that, that's the best. And 99% of the time, workers are kind of terrified but excited going into it. And there's always someone smiling at the end of it or during it. And that's just the best thing in the world. And a lot of times you get really fast or faster results than normal. Like what Aki was saying, these workers who probably, I'm guessing, complaining to each other for months about not getting their wages, and an hour after the direct action, right, have that check in hand. Sure. So those are the examples that workers need for themselves and then to show other workers. And because we all spend so much time at work or trying to find work or coming off of work, like when you're empowered at your workplace, you carry that over in all other aspects of your life, in your home life, at your kids' school, everything. Those are the things that inspire me.
I have a...
Hey, sorry. Hey,
yeah, go ahead.
Could I just throw in a quick observation, which is I was just flashing to a memory from the making of the film that didn't make it into the film, but it occurred to me and I thought it was really cool. So we were at one of the Ashi actions, right? So we were, you know, like all the Cuba folks were there kind of lining up. It's been going on for a while. So the market had like put its, you know, barricades up, the little, you know, all that stuff. The security guards were there. So and Mrs. Lee was there. She was giving her kids breakfast. And Danny Park was, who was a ED of Kiwa at the time. He, I remember, he was just filling up the space before stuff started by going and walking up to the security guards and asking them about their security, about their working situations. And you know, the security guards were responsive because life is tough for them too. Right. And I thought that was really interesting because it, you know, wouldn't have occurred to me to do that. But in retrospect, you know, it makes me realize that what we're fighting against is not just, you know, individual systems, individual people or even individual companies, but systems, right? And systems which affect a whole bunch of people.
Great stuff. In the short term that we have, speed answer, and again, I'm going to go ahead and reference a question from Ivy. What is one tangible or maybe like two tangible things that listeners, viewers can do today or tomorrow to contribute to these grassroots efforts or to honor the working class? And Robert, I'll give you the last word, but I'll go ahead and turn this around and pose it as, what is one or two things that a viewer watching Grassroots Rising, can take away, to be, that advocate or that champion for working class people or laborers. Let's go ahead and start off with Parvesh and then work our way back down.
Like I said, how that movie, it could have been just, it's so like timely still. What I've been doing, my active thing is I need to focus on my community and the people who, I don't want to convince someone who doesn't agree with me. It's too hard. It's also almost like right now with less than 2 months is not enough time. What I need to do is, it's all about, for me right now, getting we're luckier in California with the automatic mail-in ballot, but it's just checking, dotting every I and crossing every T when it comes to your registration, your mail-in ballot. We all have stories with the mail. I had a prescription didn't come for a month. I had, something deposited, from my agent. Took 4 weeks. That only normally, the 2-3 day thing. So it is palpable. It's happening. So my action item is just everyone check. Go to vote.gov. Go to lavote.net. Wherever your community is, just check your registration. Check. Make sure you're planned, and then also just do it for 2 or 3 of your friends. If we just do that much, just to begin, just to check your, how many, I remember my first time voting, I did the provisional thing because I messed up something. I should have been at my parents, not at my college,
Yeah.
So that's it. Please check your register to vote and bring 2 people to the website. Just cross those T's, dot those I's.
Definitely. Sophia, any last thoughts? What tangible things that listeners can do?
So 2 things. One is for CPA specifically, we have a lot of ongoing campaigns. So if you go to cpasf.org, I think in the lower right-hand corner, there's a button you can click to join our listserv, because in addition to worker organizing, we also do tenant and youth organizing. And then I want to echo what Parvesh said, to not just think about, oh, how can I in a noble way help these poor workers somewhere else, but to take responsibility in your own life, in your own community, to organize yourself and your coworkers, whether that's through voting or in your own workplace. If there are other coworkers organizing, organize with them.
Great. Aki.
Well, I think it's, you can also get involved. I think any of the organizations, like we're still very active, Garment Workers Center, Kiwa, all of us, like with go to Chinatown, Chinese Progressive Association, follow them, follow all of us, and support our actions. Come out in person. You can do things online also. We do social distance protests as well. So you can join us and make sure you get counted the census, and do what Parvesh said too in these elections, and vote for Prop 15. Vote for Prop 16.
Yes. Robert, you get the last word. And like I said, I kind of changed up the wording of the question, to get your opinions on what, takeaways that people, will get from Grassroots Rising, to be, that advocate for workers or even their family members who might be workers and stuff. So you get the last word.
Great. Thanks, Abe. And thanks to everybody else in this panel, and everybody that's involved in the film and the issues that the film's about. Quick ditto to all the above. I mean, it's all such important work that you all are doing, and a double emphasis on the census, because that really matters. So, and just another example of how the administration's getting away with thievery, basically thievery of our rights, our existence. So a takeaway from the film, I think, one is, so I guess the big takeaway for me is that we're all in it together, and that this is a long game. I mean, there was a reason that the film was about those, powerhouse organizations in the larger context of Asian American labor history, whose story was told using material from the VC visual archive, right? So, I think in our current moment, the precarity, regardless of what happens in November, the precarity is not going to go away. The people that have access to resources, buckets of capital are still going to, consolidate, and vulture capitalism is going to take advantage of the situation. So, to respond against that, I think I'm especially heartened and hopeful for the kind of movement building work that Aki, Sophia, and Parv as well are doing. So that's my thought for the day, for
Great.
Labor Day.
All right. Before we wrap things up, what I wanted to do is I wanted to amplify some of the call for action, things that we have been talking about and that our panelists have been sharing. And by way of a screenshot, that's going to kind of look a little bit janky because I can't get rid of the toolbars and what have you, but we're just going to do it because it gets really important. What I wanted to do is I wanted to go ahead and amplify some of the very, very important things that that a lot of of folks are involved in. So for people who are interested in finding out about all the things that the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance is doing. Here's their website. As I mentioned, it is a national organization, and a lot of different organizations are part of this larger umbrella. And I do encourage you to go to that site and explore and learn about some of the actions that are happening on behalf of working people and some of the things that is really, really important to people such as Parvesh and many of his associates. I did mention that Parvesh, besides being an actor, is also again a advisory board member of APALA, and so I wanted to emphasize that if anybody was interested in finding out about APALA or Asian Pacific American Labor or the election from Parvesh, directly, just hit him up on his Twitter. He'd be happy to share some thoughts and direct you to some of the resources that that he knows and thinks is very, very valuable in these very challenging times and stuff. So again, it's very simple. Parvesh, twitter.com. So also, Sophia did mention the Chinese Progressive Association. There again are a lot of different autonomous CPAs throughout the nation. But as I mentioned earlier, that one of the things that I've always admired her for is her ongoing work in advocating for workers who are experiencing wage theft, among many, many other things and stuff. And so if you want to find out about some of the things that her organization is doing, her website is right there. Working a little bit more locally, in the heart of historic Filipino town, Los Angeles, is the Filipino Workers Center. Again, to find out about so many of the other activities that that Aki and her crew and her team are working on behalf of working people. Just go to their website, pwc of Southern California.org, and just basically hit them up and find out how you guys can get involved. Robert, I have known for a long, long time. He is a maker of documentary films. I believe that one of his first efforts that that I have shown of his was a work called Saigon USA, which basically looks at the evolution of a Vietnamese American community in Southern California, and for that matter nationally. Currently, he is a member of a confederation of Asian Pacific American documentary filmmakers who in 2006 formed an organization as a direct result of the IDA Getting Real conference called the Asian American Documentary Network. If you want to find out about what the documentary network is doing, it's very simple. Their website is a-doc.org, and you'll be finding out so many very important and valuable things that they are all working on, and what have you. So, Robert, we're really, really glad that you're here, also advocating for, ADOC as well. And if I can, very quickly do a couple of commercials for our organization. As I mentioned, Visual Communications is the nation's premier Asian Pacific American Media Arts Center, and we are currently in week 21 of our golden anniversary year. People may know us, through an event, that I consider to be, the film festival that, does not end, but nobody, has really bothered to, tell us about it. Let me go ahead and share back again. This is, of course, whoops. Let me see here, the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. We're going to be starting on September 24th, October 31st. And, gosh, this festival seems to have been lasting forever, because we did, the first round of this back in May and what have you. But, for anybody, who is interested in finding out what is the new hotness in terms of Asian American Pacific Islander cinema, as well as a lot of topics that are very, very important, to all of us, whether or not we are workers, advocates, what have you. Just check out the schedule, which I believe is online now at festival.vcmedia.org. I know that, Parvesh, as a veteran of this festival, he has been able to engage many, many people from all walks of life through this, and you're, definitely looking, towards that. Also, I wanted to make mention of the fact that with our 50th anniversary year, we were supposed to have a gala, to commemorate that 50th anniversary. We are going to have that. It's going to happen probably in the later part of the 50th anniversary year, perhaps maybe in the springtime. But for now, what's going to happen is that we're going to be doing a online virtual gala, which is going to serve as a very, very important check-in, for us to see where we are at 50, as well as, the Asian American, cinema activists and people's, community as well, through the powerful medium, of cinema. So, save that date. Again, more details will be coming. With that, I want to go ahead and, finish, things off here. And I just want to, basically say thank you so very much, for giving us a part of your Labor Day, to chat with us, Robert, Aki, Sophia, and Parvesh. You guys are among, many, many folks who, whose work, has intersected with visual communications activities, and we, deeply thank you and appreciate you for, taking the time out of your day to be a part of it. This conversation is being recorded, and it will, be, posted, online so that people can come back to it. And we do, plan on making it available again through Election Day, November 3rd, because first and foremost of all of us have a vested interest in making sure, that, this long 3-year national nightmare is over. We're about 55 days away from Judgment Day, and we all are going to be talking about this and what those ramifications are if we get 4 more years of I don't know what. So anyways, again, I want to thank you all again. I want to thank everybody who's joined in on our conversation. Robert, thank you so very much. Aki, again, appreciate, your perspectives. Sophia, thank you so very, very much. We learned a lot. And, Parvesh, if your background isn't apparent, we got to drive the devil out. So, so anyways, I want to thank, all of you again. And, for all of you out there, happy Labor Day. And, we will see you next time. Stay safe. Take care.
Bye. Happy
Bye.
Labor Day.
Thank you, Abe.
Thank you.